Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the economy in Bolivia. Now, Bolivia is a country in South America that's actually landlocked, so it doesn't have any coastline. And it was recently reported that there was a coup attempt. So one of the military leaders took over a parliamentary square and actually tried to storm the building where the president was located in order to try to displace him from running the country. Now, the coup attempt failed, and there are now a lot of rumours circulating that this wasn't an actual coup. It was something that was cooked up by the president. Now, that's unsubstantiated. The president is denying any involvement at all. But his popularity ratings have apparently increased since the coup attempt took place. So in today's video, I want to go through some of the details as to what's going on in Bolivia and why the people of Bolivia are very unhappy. So I'll have a look at what the country's main business is, and I can tell you that it isn't the production of cocaine. In the 80s and 90s, Bolivia was famous for producing coca leaves, which are used as the raw ingredient to produce cocaine. However, over the last 20 or 30 years, there has been a major push by the Bolivian authorities to try to reduce that, and it's been displaced. It's no longer the second largest producer of cocoa leaves. It's actually dropped down to the third largest. So it's still producing quite a lot, but not as many as it was back in the 80s when the phrase Bolivian marching powder was quite commonly used all around the world. So in today's video, we'll have a look at what trade Bolivia is actually involved in. It's got a lot of natural resources such as oil, gas, gold, tin, zinc, lithium, lots of things that you can mine. So we'll have a look at what's going on with its actual business. We'll then talk about what's going on with regards to its imports and its exports. We'll have a look at what's happening with inflation and interest rates. And you'll see some really interesting statistics here because at face value, Bolivia looks like it's doing really well. When you look at all of the details, you'll think that this is a really healthy, strong economy. But as with a lot of countries like this, the government is actually providing huge subsidies to the people of Bolivia, and it's having to fund those subsidies from its reserves, and those reserves are now dangerously low. And that's one of the reasons why this coup attempt took place. So we'll go through all of the details of what's happening in the economy, and then finally today I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think is likely to happen over the course of the next 6 to 12 months in the Bolivian economy and what the impact of this will be on the rest of the world. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say once again, thank you so much to everyone that supported the channel. Really do mean this. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks lately, thank you for the time and effort and the generosity. It really does mean a lot to me. And if you're a long-term supporter of the channel, either through Patreon, where you'll get early access to the videos and be able to watch them advert-free, or YouTube membership, where you'll also get early access, or buy me a coffee membership, thank you for that support. Really means a lot to me. Helps keep me motivated, helps make me think more videos on a regular basis to post as often as I can. So can't thank you enough for that support. Bolivia is a landlocked country located in west central South America and is bordered to the north and east by Brazil, to the southeast by Paraguay, to the south by Argentina, to the southwest and west by Chile, and to the northwest by Peru, with whom it shares the second largest lake in South America, Lake Titicaca. Bolivia is traditionally regarded as a highland country, with 1/3 of its territory located in the Andes Mountains, and La Paz is officially the highest capital city in the world at 12,000 feet above sea level. Bolivian highland animal life is distinguished by the presence of members of the camel family, notably llamas, alpacas and guanacos. And Bolivia has the highest number of llamas out of any country in the world, and it's estimated to have around 62% of the global population. Bolivia came under Spanish rule in the early part of the 16th century, when the Spanish took over the whole of the Inca Empire, and much of the indigenous population of Bolivia were forced to work in mines established by the Spaniards. Bolivia is a country that's rich in a variety of natural resources, including oil, which was first discovered in the 1920s, natural gas, gold, zinc, tin and lithium. After more than 200 years of Spanish rule, in 1825, an army under the leadership of Marshal Antonio José de Sucre liberated Upper Peru with the aid of defecting royalists, and the defectors convinced Simón Bolívar and Sucre to allow autonomy for Upper Peru rather than union with either Peru or Argentina. And the defectors convinced the leaders of the revolution, Simon Bolivar and Sucre, to allow autonomy for the Upper Peru region. And in recognition for Simon Bolivar's support, congressional leaders named the new republic Bolivia in his honour, and they invited Sucre, his chief aide, to be the first president. The population of Bolivia today is around 12.5 million, and as you can see, the population is still growing and has a classical bell-shaped population pyramid.
This is the moment Bolivian President Luis Arce confronted Army General Juan José Zúñiga, who led a failed effort to overthrow the government after attempting to storm the presidential palace and ramming the entrance with an armored vehicle.
Hemos reaccionado y también el pueblo movilizado ha hecho posible que hoy hagamos retroceder esta intentona golpista.
El presidente me dijo que la situación está muy jodida, esta semana va a ser crítica, esta semana. Entonces es necesario preparar algo para levantar mi popularidad. Entonces me dice, y le pregunto, ¿sacamos los blindados? Saca.
Hours later, Zúñiga was seen handcuffed on live TV after his arrest for the failed coup attempt, which has raised fears that democracy in Bolivia remains at risk. On Thursday, it was revealed by a senior interior minister that the Bolivian government had intelligence that a coup attempt could occur, and that Arce had received reports about destabilization attempts. Arce has since slammed the coup attempt and swiftly named a new top general. According to a government official, Zúñiga had been told a day before the coup attempt that he would be stripped of his position. The former commander is now among 17 people who have been detained so far and could face prison terms of between 15 and 30 years. Wednesday's events uncovered the tense political fault lines in the South American country ahead of the presidential election next year. Arce's Socialist Party is split between backing him and his former mentor turned political rival, ex-president Evo Morales. Zúñiga had recently said that Morales should not be able to run again for president and had threatened to block him if he attempted to do so.
This chart shows the breakdown of Bolivia's exports. And as you can see, the largest single export is actually natural gas. As I mentioned earlier in the video, oil was originally found in Bolivia in the early 1920s, and the oil business was developed significantly in the 1960s. However, as a result of a lack of investment and also falling reserves, the oil industry has now fallen away in Bolivia and does not represent a significant amount of export income. However, it does have large reserves of natural gas, and it provides natural gas through pipelines directly to both Brazil and Argentina. And as a result of this, the sale of natural gas equates to around 22% of total export revenues. The second biggest earner of export revenue is gold. And whilst Bolivia does have its own gold mines, it isn't in the top 20 gold producing countries. However, because the economy of Bolivia is actually relatively small, gold represents a significant percentage of its annual income. The third largest source of export revenue is soybeans, and as you can see here, it's been split out into three different categories. Soybean meal represents 7.5%, oil 6.4%, and soybeans themselves 2.5%. So combined, soybeans represent around 16.5% of Bolivia's total annual income. The fourth largest source of income is zinc, which is also mined in the country and represents around 12% of revenue. And Bolivia also mines a variety of other natural resources, including tin, lead, and lithium. And this chart shows a breakdown of the countries that Bolivia is exporting to. And as you can see, its largest trading partner is actually India, which represents 16.5% of total export revenue, followed by the neighbouring countries of Brazil, which represents almost 14%, Argentina, which is close to 13%, and Colombia, which is just under 8%. Japan is Bolivia's fifth largest trading partner, followed by Peru, China, South Korea, the United Arab Emirates, and Ecuador. This chart shows Bolivia's natural gas production between 2010 and 2023. And the scale on the left-hand side is shown in billions of cubic meters and goes from 0 at the bottom to 25 billion at the top. And what this chart shows is that between 2010 and 2014, the amount of natural gas being produced increased in every single year, and rose from just under 15 billion in 2010 to more than 22 billion in 2014. However, between 2014 and 2023, there have been annual reductions in the amount of gas produced, and the figure of 13.4 billion cubic meters produced in 2023 is the lowest out of any of the last 14 years. And there are two reasons why the amount of natural gas being produced is falling. Firstly, Bolivia's gas fields are maturing and therefore they're producing less gas. Bolivia has taken a lot of the gas out of the ground already, and so it's got a diminishing level of supply. And secondly, there's been a lack of investment in Bolivia. They haven't been looking for new gas fields, they haven't been doing the exploration and trying to keep those gas supplies up. And as a result of that, the natural gas reserves are diminishing. And this chart, which has been produced by industry experts Wood Mackenzie, forecasts that the rate of decline of natural gas in Bolivia is likely to accelerate, partly due to that lack of investment and partly due to the fact that the gas fields are now getting older and therefore will produce less gas. And obviously this is really bad news for Bolivia because natural gas is its biggest single export. This chart shows the annual gross domestic product for Bolivia dating back to 2012. And the scale on the right hand side of this chart is shown in billions of US dollars and goes from $25 billion at the bottom to $49 billion at the top. And what you can see from these figures is that back in 2012, the gross domestic product was just over $27 billion. Over the following 7 years, Bolivia experienced gradual and steady increases in GDP, and by 2019, the year before the COVID-19 pandemic struck the globe, GDP had got up to $41 billion. In 2020, as a result of the pandemic, it fell back down to $37 billion. However, over the last 3 years, Bolivia has once again seen an increase in its GDP, and in 2023, total GDP was just under $46 billion. And if we look at the 12-month rolling quarterly figures, you can see that over the last 5 years, these have been predominantly in positive territory, and the only time that it fell into negative territory was during the COVID pandemic. So at face value, these figures look really good. There aren't many countries in the world that over the last 5 years has seen consistent growth in its GDP. And this chart shows the official rate of inflation in Bolivia over the last 12 months, and the scale on the right hand side of this chart goes from 1.4% at the bottom to 3.9% at the top. And what this shows is that this time last year, the official rate of inflation was 2.9%. And today it's at 3.5%, which is actually the highest level that it's been at any time in the last year. And if we expand the chart out to show what's been happening over the last 5 years, you can see that the current rate of inflation is actually the highest point in the last 5 years. So unlike the rest of the world, where we've seen high levels of inflation, partly as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then also as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Bolivia hasn't been experiencing those high level of price increases. And once again, when you look at this at face value, it tells you that the Bolivian economy should be doing really well. And if we look at what's been happening with the official rate of interest over the last 5 years, this time 5 years ago, the rate of interest was 3.65%. Over the following 3 years, the rate of interest did increase and hit a high of 4.53% in September 2022. However, since that time, interest rates have been on a downward trend. And once again, when you look at this in the context of Bolivia being a developing nation, these levels of interest are very low. These rates are more in line with what you'd expect from a developed economy. So what's going on here? Why is the Bolivian economy in such deep trouble? Well, the reason is partly because of what the government is doing with regards to controlling both currency and prices. This chart shows the official exchange rate between the US dollar and the Bolivian boliviano over the past 5 years. And what you can see here is a managed currency. Normally when we're looking at movements in the exchange rate between currencies, we see waves. So often you'll have periods where the currency is increasing in value, followed by periods where it's decreasing in value. However, what we've got here is very much a static position. And if you look at the scale on the right hand side here, it goes from $1 to 1.6.725 up to $1 to 1.6975. So a very narrow range. And you can see that there's been some slight movement over the past 5 years, but not a lot. And the reason for that is that the Bolivian government is setting this exchange rate, so they are managing it. It isn't floating at all. And that's one of the reasons why inflation is at such low levels, because the Bolivian government is actually providing a whole host of different subsidies. It's subsidizing things like the price of food and fuel to keep the prices low for the people of Bolivia. But the problem with that is that the government is having to make up the difference. So as the price of things like oil and wheat rise in the international markets, the Bolivian government basically pays more for it, but doesn't pass on that increase in cost to consumers. So that's putting additional pressure on the reserves and the cash that the government is sitting on. This chart shows Bolivia's balance of trade over the past 12 months. And as we've discussed before, the balance of trade is simply the difference between the value of all of your exports, so the money that you're being paid, and the cost of all of your imports, so the amount that you're having to pay away. And the scale on the right-hand side of this chart is shown in millions of US dollars and goes from minus 195 million at the bottom to plus 195 million at the top. And what this chart shows is that in every single one of the past 6 months, Bolivia has recorded a negative balance of trade, which means that the cost of its imports are more than the value of its exports, so it's having to pay for the difference using its reserves. And if we expand the scale of the chart out to show what's been happening over the past 5 years, you can see that over the past 2 years since May 2022, there's been a significant worsening in the balance of trade. We've got a clear downward trend here, and this is concerning from Bolivia's point of view because as the balance of trade moves into negative territory, it's having to dig into its reserves to pay for all of the things that it needs to import. This chart shows the quarterly movement in Bolivia's capital flows, so basically the amount of money that the government is spending compared with how much money it's got coming in over the past 5 years. And the difference between this chart and the balance of trade is that the balance of trade is just looking at the difference between exports and imports. This chart is showing the real cash position. So as I mentioned earlier, because Bolivia is subsidizing things like fuel and food prices in the country for consumers, the government is having to spend more on those imports than it's receiving from selling those goods to the people of Bolivia. And this represents a huge financial burden for Bolivia. And what this chart shows is that over the past 5 years, there have only been 2 quarters where the capital flows have been positive, which means that in 18 out of the 20 quarters, the government has had to supplement the amount of cash that it's receiving with money from its reserves. And of course, this is putting a huge amount of pressure on the government, and this is an unsustainable position. You can't keep dipping into your reserves to keep funding subsidies, because at some point your reserves will run out, and when that happens, there will be financial chaos, because prices will then have to revert back to the market levels that we're seeing globally, and that would result in huge pressure being applied on households in Bolivia. This chart shows the movement in the money supply in Bolivia over the past 10 years. And the supply of money is important because, generally speaking, if you keep increasing the amount of money in your economy, it tends to generate inflation because you're basically printing more and more cash. People will spend more, that drives up demand, and therefore prices will go up and inflation will rise. And what we can see here is that over the past 10 years, there has been a continual increase in the supply of money in Bolivia. So in normal circumstances, this sort of increase in the money supply would definitely be resulting in high levels of inflation. But as we saw earlier in the video, inflation has actually been at relatively low levels at all points over the past 10 years. And the reason for that is because the government in Bolivia has been taking up the slack. They've actually been funding the difference between the market price of things like fuel and food and the price that the consumers in Bolivia are paying. And as a result of that, Bolivia has been dipping into its reserves to fund that difference. And that's one of the reasons why the economy is in such a dire situation now, because it's spent all of its money keeping prices low whilst it's pumping more and more cash into the economy. This chart shows the movement in Bolivia's net foreign currency reserves between 2010 and 2024. And what this shows is that in the 4 years between 2010 and 2014, Bolivia's reserves were actually increasing and increased from around $10 billion to $15 billion. However, over the last 10 years, there has been a significant reduction in the amount of Bolivia's reserves, and today total reserves are sitting at less than $2 billion. And this is now threatening both Bolivia's economic stability and its managed exchange rate. And this chart shows the movement in Bolivia's gold reserves over the last 10 years. And the scale on the right-hand side of this chart is shown in tonnes and goes from 33 million tonnes at the bottom to 45 million at the top. And what this shows is that historically, Bolivia was sitting on large reserves of gold, around 42.5 million tonnes. However, as a result of the fall in its foreign currency reserves and the pressure that this was applying on the Bolivian economy, in 2023 the Bolivian authorities passed a new law referred to as the Gold Law, which allowed the Bolivian Central Bank to sell 17 tonnes of gold, which in total raised around $1 billion of cash. And one of the reasons why the Bolivian Central Bank did this was in order to repay a bond that was maturing of $183 million on August the 22nd, 2023. Now, as a result of this large sale, the amount of gold that Bolivia was holding reduced to 26.1 million tonnes, and by law, the amount of gold being held cannot drop below 22 million. However, since February 2024, the central bank has stopped publishing weekly data providing details of how much gold is being held, and concerns are now rising that more gold may have been sold and that Bolivia's reserves are actually less than shown on this chart. This chart shows Bolivia's national debt dating back to 2007 and forecast out to 2029. And what you can see here is that the amount of national debt has increased in every single year, rising from just under $6 billion back in 2007 to $38.5 billion in 2023. And it's forecast that the total debt will almost double to $63.6 billion by 2029. And in terms of putting that into perspective, this chart shows the amount of debt as a percentage of GDP. And what this chart shows is that in 2014, total debt equated to around 37% of total GDP. However, between 2014 and 2020, there was a rapid increase in the percentage, and by 2020, debt equated to 78% of GDP. It rose to 81.4% in 2021 and has remained above 80% in each of the last 3 years. And just to put that into perspective, the IMF recommends the debt to GDP ratio should not be more than 60%. And in a recent study, the World Bank found that countries that have a ratio of more than 77% suffer significant deterioration in their economic performance. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because Bolivia is a country that we haven't discussed before, and I'm always interested to find more countries, more economies to talk to you about and to find out what's going on there. And as we've seen from today's data, Bolivia is actually asset rich. Unlike a lot of countries that are in financial difficulty, it's got a large supply of natural gas. It did have oil in the past, but it's depleted all of that oil. And it's also got lots of minerals that are really valuable, such as gold and lithium and tin and plenty of other things. So at face value, you would think that Bolivia should be doing quite well. And as we saw from the actual statistics, when you look at the economic factors, it does look like it's doing fantastically well. Inflation has been completely under control over the past 10 years, more so than developed economies such as the USA and the UK, where we've seen wild swings in inflation. And interest rates have also remained at relatively low levels. So you might be thinking, well, what's the problem? Why are people trying to overthrow the current rulers of Bolivia? Well, the reason is because of what's going on behind the scenes. So the Bolivian authorities are providing huge subsidies to keep the price of things like fuel and food down for the people of Bolivia. So that's obviously good news. If you live there, you don't have to pay a lot. And that fuel prices are currently around 25% of what you'll see around the globe. So these are massive subsidies. But the problem with subsidies, as we've talked about before, is that somebody has to pay for them. And that somebody is the government of Bolivia. And they've been dipping into their reserves over the past 10 years. And as we saw, the value of the reserves has crashed from around 15 billion to 2 billion currently. And at a time when it needed its money the most, it decided to change the laws to be able to sell more of its most valuable asset, gold. And so a large chunk of gold was sold in 2023, realizing around $1 billion in cash. But you can't keep going to the cupboard and raiding the family jewels, because at some point those family jewels run out. And that's the situation that Bolivia finds itself in right now. It's got to the point where its reserves are dangerously low, and the Bolivian government simply can't afford to keep providing all of those subsidies. The books don't balance. The money that they've got coming in doesn't equate to the amount of cash that it's spending. So this is similar to you being constantly overdrawn at your bank. At some point, something is going to break. And that's the concern in Bolivia right now. Now, we've got an election coming up in 2025. And the problem that you have when you have an election coming up is that the existing rulers always want to keep everybody happy. So they don't want to introduce policies that are going to introduce hardship and austerity. So it's unlikely that the current president is going to cut all of the subsidies and see prices rising rapidly, because he would then be voted out of power. So what we're likely to see over the next 6 to 12 months is a continuation of the existing situation. That's going to apply even more pressure on the reserves in Bolivia. There is therefore a possibility that the Bolivian authorities could introduce another law allowing more gold to be sold, and we could get to a situation where Bolivia has no reserves whatsoever. And if it gets to that point, then there is a real possibility that we could see an economic collapse occurring in Bolivia. And when you look at its most valuable export, which is natural gas, that's been in decline for the last 10 years as a result of the fact that they haven't been reinvesting into the business. So they haven't been trying to find more reserves, more gas fields to keep the flow going. And it was recently announced that Argentina is looking to buy gas elsewhere, that it doesn't feel that it can rely on Bolivian gas, and so it's going to get alternative suppliers. And that's obviously going to make things worse in Bolivia, because if it loses one of its biggest customers, then its revenue is going to fall even faster, it'll have less cash, and therefore the economy is even more at risk of going into collapse. So the overall summary of today's video is that the situation in Bolivia, whilst at face value, it looks like it's doing really well when you look at inflation, interest rates, and GDP. They all look really positive. What's going on behind the scenes is causing major problems. The government is spending its reserves really rapidly, and if it doesn't sort things out at some point in the near future, we could see Bolivia entering a state of economic collapse. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative, and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.